Hey everyone, welcome back to Grace Note Forge. So in my last video, I went over my mold making process for making a RTV wax injection mold for this piece. And I'll leave a link down in the description where you can find that. But in this video, I'm going to be going over my process for lost wax casting this pendant and talk a little bit about my setup for casting. And just a quick disclaimer, a lot of what I'm going to be doing is based off of my own experience. And this is by no means the best way of going about lost wax casting, so as always, take any tips you like and leave the stuff you don't. So for this piece, I want to try casting a few different metals, and as a test, I'm going to try one flask using sterling silver, and another using some scrap brass that I just happen to have lying around, just to see what it looks like and if I can cast with it. But the casting process should be the same for both. And this brass, or at least what I hope is brass, is from an old fire pit setup that I'll have to cut up into more manageable pieces in order to be used for casting. And looking at these parts closer, the inside looks really coarse, which makes me think that these parts were most likely cast in sand and then machined to a finer finish. So hopefully it's suitable for casting, but we'll just have to test it out and see how it goes. So in my last video, I talked about adding these little extra gates to help with filling the mold and preventing air bubbles. But what I'd like to do is make a few test pieces in both flasks to have some with the gate and some without, just to see if it'll make a difference with the finished casting. And personally, I don't think that it will, but my thinking is that if it'll cast fine without it, it's going to be a lot easier to remove and clean up now, rather than trying to remove and clean them up when they're cast in metal. And to remove them, I'm just going to cut them off using an X-Acto knife, and use the wood burning pen just like I did before to smooth out the surface. Now, because I'm going to be using these relatively small flasks that are only 2.5 by 2.5 inches, I'm only going to use 3 wax models per flask. And before I start adding them to the sprue base, I'm going to weigh them and calculate how much metal I'm going to need, making sure to add a little extra to account for the button, which is really important for casting. Now these flasks come with a matching rubber base to attach the wax models to, so I'm going to start by adding some wax to fill in this sprue hole and then attaching the models to the base using the existing sprues. And for each mold, I'm going to slightly angle the models outward to give them more space between one another. And once everything is attached, I'm going to double check that I'll have enough clearance between the wax models and the top of the flask, because I don't want to have them too close and risk a blowout in the investment when casting, which is where the investment breaks away while on the vacuum table and all the molten metal comes pouring out. So now that the flasks are ready, I'm going to start mixing up the investment and fill them up. But really quick before I pour the investment, I'm going to add some tape around the rim of the flasks, because when it's placed into a vacuum chamber to degas, the investment will expand and end up overflowing out of the top. And once the investment is measured out and mixed, I'm going to place it into a vacuum chamber to remove the air bubbles and quickly pour it into the flasks. And I'm aiming to have about a 1/8 gap at the top of the flasks to allow for more even suction when put on the vacuum table. And I'll explain that more in just a little bit. Then I'm going to vacuum the investment one more time, and I like to use a plastic bag to help reduce the splatter from the popping air bubbles. Then the flasks are left to set for at least 2 hours. Afterward, the tape and rubber base can be removed and the flask can be cleaned up a bit. And now you can get a closer look at that 1/8 gap that I was talking about. For casting with a vacuum table, this little gap is really important for a few reasons. One is that it allows for a better seal when placed on the table, and two, it gives a more even suction through the flask than if the vacuum was placed right up against the investment. Now these should be good to be placed into a kiln right now to start the burnout cycle, but I'm not going to put these into the kiln until tomorrow. So to keep them from losing too much moisture and potentially cracking during the burnout, I'm going to put them into a Ziploc bag until then. And to burn out the flasks, I'm using a Paragon SC2 Kiln. And for the first few hours, I like to use this stainless steel tray to catch the wax when it starts melting out. This is mostly to reduce the amount of fumes that you would get from burning off all that unnecessary wax, but it's also supposed to help increase the lifespan of the kiln, because without it, that melted wax would just soak into the fibers of the kiln bed and then burn away. That could end up causing damage. And I'm going to be using a pretty standard burnout cycle, starting at 300 degrees Fahrenheit, then rising to 700, then topping out at 1350 degrees, until dropping back down to my casting temperature at 1000 degrees. And to melt the silver, I'm just going to be using some ordinary map gas with a standard torch head. Now these next few steps need to be done pretty fast, because every second the flask is outside of the kiln, it's losing heat. So in order to heat up the silver in the crucible and take the flasks out of the kiln at the same time, I made a mount for my torch to keep the heat on the crucible until it's ready to cast. And admittedly, this is not the safest option, but it definitely helps, especially with casting and filming everything by myself. And this is my order of operations for casting. I start heating up the silver with the torch, and once the silver starts to melt a bit, I put the torch on the mount and add a little bit of flux. Then I turn on the vacuum table and take the flasks out of the kiln, making sure they're secure to the table with a good seal. I then continue to heat up the silver until it's ready to pour, and once it's cast, I add a little bit of flux to the button to help reduce oxidation. I then turn off the vacuum and remove the flask and wait until it's ready to quench. As soon as the button reaches a dull red color, it's ready to be quenched in water and break away the investment, revealing the casting. And with the brass scrap, I wasn't able to melt down a large amount with the map gas, so I just opted to throw the whole crucible in the forge. And these are the raw castings with most of the investment cleaned off. The silver models came out pretty well with just a few minor blemishes, and you can see removing that gate turned out to not make a difference at all, so it's definitely a good idea to remove that prior to casting. One of the small spirals didn't really fill in completely, which I'm sure is due to poor technique on my part. And with the brass pieces, I ended up accidentally letting the crucible get too hot, which I think is the reason for the excess fire scale. So they're definitely not perfect, but it's a pretty good starting point. The brass pieces were kind of an experiment, but after polishing up a few of them, I actually really like how they look. So I'll definitely have to give brass another try. But that'll be for another video. Until then, let me know what you think down in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching.